In the sleepy town of Woodstock, Vermont, where the golden leaves of autumn blanket the ground and the morning air smells of damp earth and chimney smoke, life seems almost frozen in a simpler time. Among its winding country roads and picturesque farms lies a small bed and breakfast inn called the Silver Elm. It was here, nestled in the heart of the Green Mountains, that something truly extraordinary unfolded. At first glance, the Silver Elm seemed like an ordinary retreat for weary travelers. Its wooden sign creaked in the wind, and a weathered swing swayed gently on the porch. But behind its charm was a small, surprising tale of survival, trust, and an unshakable bond formed between two creatures who couldn't be more different. A scrappy calico cat named Maisie, and an injured gray squirrel who would come to be known as Pip. Maisie was no stranger to the Silver Elm. She was a stray who had wandered onto the property years ago, her wiry fur matted and her ribs visible beneath her patchy coat. The owner of the inn, an elderly woman named Helen, couldn't resist taking her in. Despite her tough exterior, Maisie had a gentle spirit. She often perched on the window ledges, surveying the changing seasons, or stretched lazily in a patch of sunlight. But her life was about to change in a way no one could have anticipated. It was a chilly October morning when Maisie first encountered Pip. Helen had just finished her morning coffee and opened the back door to feed the blue jays and chickadees that frequented her yard. Maisie usually prowled around the perimeter of the garden, pretending to hunt for mice, but more often settling for napping in the grass. This morning, however, something unusual caught her attention. A small, trembling squirrel at the base of the elm tree. Pip was barely more than a juvenile, his tiny body battered and weak. His fur was ruffled, and his left hind leg dragged awkwardly behind him. He had likely fallen from his nest or been attacked by a predator. Against all odds, he had managed to crawl to the safety of the tree's roots. Maisie's sharp eyes caught his movement immediately, and her ears flattened as her hunter's instincts kicked in. She crept closer, her belly brushing the ground. But as she drew nearer, something strange happened. Pip didn't scurry away in fear as most squirrels would. He was too weak to run, and his wide, dark eyes met Maisie's with a look of raw desperation. For a long, tense moment, Maisie crouched, her tail flicking, as if deciding whether to pounce. But then, slowly, she sat back on her haunches, tilted her head, and let out a low, curious meow. Helen, watching from the porch, held her breath. Maisie had always been a solitary creature, and no one expected her to take pity on an injured squirrel. But instead of attacking or chasing Pip, Maisie did something remarkable. She gently nudged him with her nose, as if testing his response. When Pip didn't move, she lay down beside him, curling her tail protectively around his fragile body. It was an unlikely beginning to an even unlikelier friendship. Over the next few days, Helen kept a close eye on the pair. Pip was too injured to return to the wild, so Helen began leaving small bowls of mashed nuts and fruit near the tree for him to eat. Maisie, surprisingly, became his self-appointed guardian. She would lie beside him for hours, keeping him warm as the autumn nights grew colder. The other guests at the inn were enchanted by the sight. It wasn't every day that you saw a cat and a squirrel sharing a quiet moment under the shade of a tree. People began snapping photos and sharing them online, where the story of Maisie and Pip quickly went viral. But what no one realized was that their bond went far deeper than a simple act of companionship. In the days to come, Maisie and Pip would face challenges that would test the strength of their unlikely friendship. From surviving the harsh Vermont winter to fending off predators that saw Pip as an easy target, their journey was one of resilience, courage, and unshakable trust. Little did anyone know, they were about to prove that love and loyalty can transcend the boundaries of species. As the days turned into weeks, Maisie and Pip's bond deepened in ways no one could have predicted. Pip's injuries were slow to heal. His hind leg remained weak, making it impossible for him to climb trees as other squirrels do instinctively. Maisie, ever watchful, seemed to sense this vulnerability and took it upon herself to be his protector. Wherever Pip ventured, whether to the base of the maple tree or a patch of clover near the garden, Maisie was never far behind, her green eyes scanning the horizon for danger. But nature is rarely kind to the frail, and as the Vermont autumn gave way to winter, the challenges grew more severe. The once colorful canopy of leaves was replaced by bare branches, and the air turned biting and unforgiving. Pip could no longer scavenge for the food he needed to survive, and his frailty made him an easy target for hawks that circled the skies above the silver elm. The first real test of their friendship came one frosty morning in early December. Helen had gone into town to buy supplies, and the inn's guests were still asleep, leaving the property quiet and still. Maisie and Pip were playing near the garden shed, a makeshift fortress where Pip often hid. Pip had started to regain some of his strength, and he was cautiously exploring the snowy ground, his tiny paws sinking into the cold, powdery surface. Maisie sat nearby, her tail flicking as she batted at a dried leaf that tumbled across the snow. She was distracted, and that was when it happened. A shadow passed overhead, a large red-tailed hawk swooping low, its keen eyes locked onto Pip. The attack was swift. The hawk's talons slashed through the air, aiming directly for the defenseless squirrel. Pip froze in terror, his instincts paralyzed by the predator's looming presence. But Maisie didn't hesitate. With a guttural yowl that echoed across the yard, she launched herself at the hawk, her claws extended and her teeth bared. The two animals collided in a flurry of feathers and fur. The hawk screeched, flapping its massive wings as Maisie clawed at its face, desperate to protect her tiny friend. Pip scrambled back to the safety of the shed, his heart pounding as he watched the fierce battle unfold. After what felt like an eternity, the hawk finally retreated, rising into the sky with a furious cry. Maisie limped back to Pip, her fur ruffled and her left ear torn from the fight. She let out a low, comforting purr, nudging him with her nose as if to say, "You're safe now." It was a moment that cemented their bond, a selfless act of courage that proved Maisie wasn't just a protector. She was Pip's family. But the challenges didn't end there. The harsh winter brought with it another trial: hunger. With snow covering the ground and most of the trees bare, food became increasingly scarce. Helen did her best to provide for both animals, leaving bowls of nuts and kibble near the back porch, but it wasn't always enough. Pip began to lose weight, his energy waning as the weeks dragged on. Maisie, ever resourceful, started to hunt with renewed determination. She was no stranger to the art of survival, having lived as a stray for years before finding her home at the Silver Elm. Now, she used those skills to provide for Pip. While she had never shown much interest in catching mice before, she began to bring back small catches from the woods, leaving them near Pip's hiding spot. At first, Pip seemed hesitant, his instincts telling him that eating meat was unnatural. But hunger eventually won out, and Maisie's offerings became a lifeline that kept him alive. Their partnership didn't go unnoticed by Helen, who watched with a mix of awe and concern. "They need each other," she murmured to herself one snowy evening as she watched Maisie and Pip curled up together on the porch, their bodies pressed close for warmth. "But I'm not sure how long this can last." Helen's worries proved valid when tragedy struck again in late January. A powerful snowstorm rolled through Vermont, blanketing the town in nearly 2 feet of snow and plunging the temperatures well below freezing. The storm knocked out power at the inn, leaving the house dark and cold. Helen did her best to keep the animals warm, bringing them inside and setting up a small nest of blankets near the fireplace. But Pip, unused to the indoors, became restless. He darted out through a crack in the back door that had been left ajar, disappearing into the blizzard. Helen and Maisie searched frantically, but the snow was falling so heavily that visibility was nearly zero. Hours passed and Pip didn't return. Maisie refused to give up. She paced near the door, her eyes fixed on the swirling snow outside. When Helen finally opened the door to let her out, Maisie bolted into the storm without hesitation, her body disappearing into the white abyss. For hours, she searched, her sharp senses guiding her through the bitter cold. She followed faint traces of Pip's scent, her paws sinking into the snow as the wind howled around her. It wasn't until nearly dawn that she found him, huddled beneath a fallen tree branch, his tiny body shivering uncontrollably. Maisie curled around him, shielding him from the cold as best she could. She let out soft, urgent meows, trying to rouse him, but Pip was weak, too weak to move on his own. With a surge of determination, Maisie did something extraordinary. She began to drag him, inch by inch, back toward the safety of the inn. By the time Maisie and Pip reached the porch, the first light of morning was breaking through the storm clouds. Helen opened the door and gasped at the sight. Maisie, her fur caked with ice, standing protectively over Pip, who was barely clinging to life. Helen scooped them both up and brought them inside, placing Pip near the fire and wrapping Maisie in a warm towel. As the room slowly filled with heat, Pip began to stir, his tiny body regaining some of its strength. Maisie watched over him the entire time, her eyes never leaving his fragile form. It was a harrowing night that tested not only their friendship but their will to survive. And yet, against all odds, they had made it through, together. The brutal winter storm marked a turning point in Maisie and Pip's journey. They had endured so much together, battling hunger, predators, and the bitter cold, and yet their bond had only grown stronger. But Helen knew their situation wasn't sustainable. Pip wasn't meant to live this way. As much as Maisie cared for him, a squirrel needed the freedom to climb trees, forage in the wild, and run under open skies. The night after the storm, Helen sat by the fire, stroking Maisie's fur as the calico rested in her lap. Pip, still weak but recovering, nibbled on a piece of apple nearby. The old woman's heart ached as she watched the unlikely pair. She loved them both dearly, but she also understood something that Maisie and Pip couldn't. Pip's future depended on his independence. The idea came to her the next morning as she sat with her cup of tea, gazing out at the snow-covered landscape. A wildlife rehabilitation center operated a few miles outside of town, specializing in caring for injured animals and preparing them to return to the wild. Helen had heard wonderful things about their work. She knew they had the resources to help Pip heal fully and perhaps one day rejoin his own kind. But how would Maisie react? The thought of separating the two tugged at Helen's heart. Maisie wasn't just Pip's protector. She was his family. And Pip wasn't just Maisie's ward. He was her purpose. Taking Pip away felt like breaking something sacred. Still, Helen decided it was the right thing to do. She made the call that afternoon, speaking to a kind woman named Nora, who ran the center. Nora assured her they could provide the specialized care Pip needed. "It's never easy," Nora said gently, sensing Helen's hesitation. "But if you want him to have a real chance, this is the best option." Helen hung up the phone and looked down at Maisie, who was curled up in her usual spot on the windowsill, her eyes half closed as she basked in the weak winter sunlight. "I'm doing this for him," Helen whispered, as much to herself as to the cat. "You'll understand someday." The following morning, Helen prepared a small crate lined with blankets for Pip's journey. Maisie watched intently as Helen carefully coaxed Pip into the crate, her green eyes narrowing with suspicion. As Helen carried Pip toward the door, Maisie leapt from her perch and followed, her tail high and her ears flicking nervously. When the door shut behind Helen, leaving Maisie on the porch, the cat let out a mournful yowl. She pawed at the door, her cries growing louder as Helen's car disappeared down the snowy driveway. For the first time in months, Maisie was truly alone. At the wildlife center, Pip's intake was thorough. The staff examined his weak leg, noting the old injuries that had never fully healed. "He'll need time," Nora explained to Helen. "But he's strong, and he's a fighter. With a little luck, he'll be climbing trees again by spring." Helen forced a smile, nodding, but her heart felt heavy. When she returned to the Silver Elm, Maisie was sitting exactly where Helen had left her, on the porch, her eyes fixed on the horizon as if willing Pip to return. The days that followed were marked by an eerie stillness. Maisie, once so lively and curious, became withdrawn. She no longer prowled the yard or batted at leaves. Instead, she spent most of her time in the spot where she and Pip had often curled up together, her head resting on her paws. Helen tried to comfort her, offering extra treats and even letting her sleep on the bed, a luxury Maisie had never been allowed before. But nothing seemed to lift her spirits. Meanwhile, Pip was making slow but steady progress at the wildlife center. Under Nora's care, he began to regain his strength. His weak leg grew stronger with daily exercises, and he learned to climb small branches in a controlled environment. But as much as Pip was improving physically, something seemed to be missing. He was restless, often chittering softly at the window of his enclosure, as if searching for something. Or someone. Back at the inn, Maisie's behavior began to change in unexpected ways. One night, Helen was startled awake by the sound of scratching at the door. When she opened it, she found Maisie standing on the porch, staring into the darkness. She bolted outside the moment the door opened, her small frame disappearing into the shadows. Maisie had begun searching for Pip. For days, she wandered the woods near the inn, her senses on high alert. She sniffed at tree trunks, pawed at patches of snow, and listened for the faintest sound that might lead her to her friend. It didn't matter that Pip wasn't there. Maisie refused to give up. Her determination was both heartbreaking and inspiring, a testament to the depth of their bond. And then, one fateful afternoon in early March, Helen received a call from Nora. "Pip is ready," Nora said. "He's strong enough to be released back into the wild. But there's something unusual." "What is it?" Helen asked, her heart racing. He seems lonely. We've tried introducing him to other squirrels, but he doesn't interact with them the way he should. It's almost as if he's waiting for something, or someone." Helen's breath caught in her throat. She glanced at Maisie, who was sitting by the window, staring out at the bare trees. For the first time, Helen allowed herself to consider a possibility she had dismissed before. "What if we brought him back here?" Helen asked slowly. "What if we let him decide where he belongs?" Nora hesitated but finally agreed. "It's unorthodox," she admitted, "but maybe he does belong there." A week later, Nora arrived at the Silver Elm with Pip. He was stronger now, his gray fur sleek and his eyes bright with life. When Maisie saw him, her reaction was immediate. She let out a soft, surprised meow and bounded across the yard to where Nora stood. Pip, perched in a small travel cage, began chittering excitedly, his tiny paws pressed against the bars. Helen opened the cage and Pip leapt out, landing gracefully in the snow. Maisie approached him cautiously, sniffing him as if to make sure he was real. Then, in a moment that left Helen and Nora speechless, Maisie wrapped her tail around Pip and lay down beside him, just as she had on the very first day they met. For the first time in months, everything felt right again. From the moment Pip leapt out of his travel cage and nestled beside Maisie in the snow, it was as if the winter's weight melted away. The bond they shared had defied odds, distance, and even the expectations of what nature allowed. Maisie and Pip were together again, and with their reunion came a newfound sense of purpose, not just for them, but for everyone who had witnessed their story. Pip was stronger now. He could climb low branches and dart short distances, though his hind leg would always have a slight limp. But he didn't seem to mind, nor did Maisie. She continued to stay close to him, as she had always done, but their dynamic began to shift in subtle ways. Maisie, once Pip's fierce protector, now seemed to encourage his independence. When Pip climbed a little higher than usual on the elm tree or ventured a bit farther from the porch, Maisie would watch from a distance, her green eyes calm and steady. It was as though she knew he needed to grow into the squirrel he was meant to be. Spring came to Woodstock, Vermont, in a rush of color and warmth. The snow melted into babbling brooks, the bare branches of trees burst with buds, and the air was filled with the sounds of birdsong. The Silver Elm came alive again, with guests returning to enjoy the blooming gardens and the picturesque countryside. But for many, the biggest draw was Maisie and Pip, whose story had spread far and wide after Helen shared their tale online. People from all over began to visit, hoping to catch a glimpse of the famous cat and squirrel duo. Children would gasp with delight as they watched Pip scurry across the garden, while Maisie lounged in the sun, her watchful eyes always following him. Guests would whisper in amazement as Pip perched on Maisie's back, chittering softly as she carried him to a shady spot under the elm tree. For Helen, the attention was both heartwarming and overwhelming. The Silver Elm had never been so popular, and while she appreciated the support, she worried about how it might affect Maisie and Pip. She wanted them to have a life that was peaceful, away from prying eyes. One afternoon, as Helen sat on the porch sipping iced tea, Nora stopped by to check on Pip's progress. She marveled at how well he was doing, climbing higher and moving with confidence despite his old injury. "He's thriving," Nora said, smiling as she watched Pip dart across the garden. "You've given him something we couldn't at the center, love and a sense of belonging." Helen nodded, her eyes softening as she looked at Maisie, who was curled up near the flower bed, her tail twitching as she dozed. "Maisie gave him that," she replied. "I think they saved each other." But even as Pip grew stronger, the question of his future lingered. Helen knew he couldn't stay at the inn forever. Squirrels were wild creatures, and as much as Pip adored Maisie, he was beginning to show signs of wanting to explore beyond the safety of the garden. He would climb the tallest branches of the elm tree and stare out at the forest beyond, his tiny body silhouetted against the sky. Maisie would always watch him from below, her gaze steady but unreadable. One warm evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon and painted the sky in shades of orange and pink, Helen made a decision. She would give Pip the choice, the freedom to decide where he belonged. The next morning, Helen gathered Maisie and Pip in the garden. She had set up a small platform near the base of the elm tree, filled with Pip's favorite foods, sunflower seeds, apples, and a few acorns. She hoped the offering would make him feel comfortable as he explored the wider world. "Maisie," Helen said softly, kneeling beside the cat, "I think it's time." Maisie tilted her head as if she understood. She glanced at Pip, who was nibbling on a sunflower seed, and then back at Helen. Without a sound, she padded over to Pip and nudged him gently with her nose. Pip hesitated, his tiny paws clutching an acorn. He looked at Maisie, then at the towering elm tree, and finally at the forest beyond. For a long moment, he seemed torn, his small frame trembling as if caught between two worlds. Maisie didn't move. She simply sat there, her tail curled neatly around her paws, her green eyes calm and unwavering. It was a look that seemed to say, "It's okay. You can go." And then, with a soft chitter, Pip turned and began to climb the elm tree. He moved slowly at first as if testing himself, but soon his confidence grew. Higher and higher he went until he reached a sturdy branch that stretched toward the forest. He paused there, looking back at Maisie one last time. Maisie let out a quiet, encouraging meow. With that, Pip leapt from the branch and disappeared into the trees. Helen's chest tightened as she watched him go, her heart a mix of pride and sadness. Maisie remained still, her gaze fixed on the spot where Pip had vanished. But there was no sorrow in her eyes, only quiet acceptance. Over the next few days, Maisie seemed to adjust to Pip's absence with remarkable grace. She returned to her old routines, patrolling the garden, napping on the porch, and watching the birds flit from tree to tree. But every now and then, she would sit at the base of the elm tree, her ears perked as if listening for a familiar sound. And then, one afternoon in late spring, Pip returned. Helen spotted him first, scurrying along the edge of the garden, his fur glinting in the sunlight. Maisie, sensing his presence, bolted toward him with a speed and energy that Helen hadn't seen in weeks. Pip chittered excitedly, leaping onto Maisie's back as she rolled onto her side, playfully batting at him with her paws. From that day on, Pip became a frequent visitor. He would spend his mornings exploring the forest, returning to the silver elm in the afternoons to play with Maisie and enjoy Helen's offerings of nuts and fruit. It was the perfect balance, wild and free, but never far from the home and friend that had saved him. Maisie and Pip's story became a symbol of resilience, love, and the power of unlikely friendships. Visitors continued to flock to the Silver Elm, not just to see the famous duo, but to experience the sense of hope and connection they represented. Helen, watching from her rocking chair on the porch, often found herself moved to tears. Maisie and Pip had shown her and the world that love knows no boundaries, that even the most different of creatures can find common ground, and that letting go doesn't mean losing someone forever. The story of Maisie and Pip became more than just a tale of an unlikely friendship. It became a beacon of hope for anyone who witnessed it. It was a reminder that love, loyalty, and connection can flourish in the most unexpected places, even between a scrappy calico cat and a squirrel who had once been too broken to climb. As the seasons changed and the years passed, Maisie and Pip continued their tradition of finding each other. Pip remained wild and free, thriving in the forest that had once seemed out of reach. But he never truly left the Silver Elm. He would return often, his visits as regular as the changing leaves, always finding Maisie waiting for him beneath the towering elm tree that had become a symbol of their bond. Helen, sitting on the porch with her tea, often reflected on the lessons the two animals had taught her. Life was full of challenges, storms that threatened to bury us, predators that loomed when we were most vulnerable, and moments of doubt that made us question our strength. But Maisie and Pip had shown that even in the darkest times, there is a way forward when love leads the way. Their story touched the hearts of people far beyond Woodstock, Vermont. Visitors who had come to see the cat and squirrel left the Silver Elm feeling lighter, inspired by the enduring connection between two creatures so different, yet so deeply bound. Some said they saw a bit of themselves in Maisie and Pip, a reminder of friendships they had cherished, loved ones they had lost, or the courage it took to let go of something they held dear. In the end, Maisie and Pip's friendship wasn't just about survival. It was about growth, healing, and the beauty of embracing the unknown. Pip had found his wings, in a way, leaping from the safety of the elm tree into a world full of possibilities. Maisie, in turn, had learned the quiet strength of letting go, and the joy of knowing her love had given Pip the life he was meant to live. As Helen watched the two play beneath the elm tree one bright summer afternoon, she smiled, her heart full. Maisie and Pip had reminded her, and everyone who heard their story, that bonds formed in love are never truly broken. They endure, just like the mighty trees that stand strong through every storm, their roots entwined deep in the earth. And perhaps that's the greatest lesson of all. No matter how far life takes us, love has a way of bringing us home.